Research in psychology and temperament and personality is so weird. In fact, according to Henrik and colleagues, upwards of 96% of psychological research is weird in some way. By weird, of course, I mean the acronym used to refer to research samples and their overrepresentation of Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. And in particular, there's an overrepresentation of white weird people. In their discussion of the weirdness in research, Henrik and colleagues argue that there is substantial variability in the experimental results across populations in numerous fundamental domains in psychological research, such as the heritability of IQ and moral reasoning. They also mentioned that there are no obvious a priori grounds for claiming that a particular behavioral phenomenon is universal based on sampling from a single subpopulation. This means that the overrepresentation of white weird people in research could mean that the findings from such studies are generalized to non-white, non-weird communities that may not share the same patterns of behavior, motivation, cognitive processes, and more that resulted in those particular findings. Over the past several decades, there has been substantial multicultural and racially and ethnically sensitive research to try and counteract all of that white weirdness. However, despite those efforts, the indigenous communities that live in the United States are still critically underrepresented and inaccurately captured in the research. There are 574 federally recognized tribal nations in the United States that all have to check the same Native American or Alaskan Native checkbox in studies that do make efforts to analyze ethnic or racial disparities. As of the 2010 census, these hundreds of tribes account for over 5 million people living in the United States, which is approximately 1.6% of the nation's total population. And given that these numbers increased by 39% from the 2000 census to the 2010 census, it wouldn't be unreasonable to say that these communities are even more substantial in size in 2021. Beyond just the size of indigenous communities in the US, there are several reasons why psychological and specifically temperament and personality researchers should focus more on indigenous people. First, there is an unparalleled richness and diversity among indigenous communities since each tribe and group of people are quite ethnically, culturally, and linguistically different from one another. Pictured here are women representing the Inuit tribe in Alaska on the left, and on the right is a father with his child from the Cherokee tribe in North Carolina during a 4th of July powwow. And as you can see, they're quite different. There's a lot that we can learn about patterns in the Big Five or childhood temperament from looking at these distinct and different tribes within the United States. Second, there are several concerning mental health statistics that could be related to temperament and personality within Indigenous communities. First is that Indigenous children and adolescents have the highest rates of lifetime major depressive episodes and the highest self-reported depression ratings of any racial and ethnic group, which may mean that there may be patterns of higher neuroticism and negative emotionality among Indigenous people. The second is that there is a higher prevalence and earlier initiation age of drug and alcohol use among Indigenous youths when they're compared to other ethnic and racial groups. And this could be related to lower levels of conscientiousness and self-control within this population. So there are several reasons why Indigenous people should be of greater focus in research, but there are also several barriers to research involving Indigenous communities. And a really big one is that so many Indigenous identifying people either live in the Midwest or in Alaska, and so it's quite difficult to reach areas that are densely populated with Indigenous people. Despite that and other barriers, Indigenous communities should be a population of interest in research because there's so much untapped knowledge about the trends and patterns in temperament and personality that we could gain by including Indigenous people more regularly in research. And beyond the mere quantity of information, it's also important to diversify samples beyond weird populations to be able to generalize research findings more confidently.